Darkcast Network. Out of the shadows come the best indie podcasts.
Hey everyone, welcome to True Crime California. I'm your host Cindy, and I'm glad you're here. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of True Crime California. I am your host Cindy, and I just want to call out that on last week's episode, you could totally hear my dog snoring for a good portion of the episode. And I'm so sorry about that. I had no idea. He was right next to me, but he was like under the covers and I could barely hear him. But this microphone absolutely picked him up louder than I would have ever imagined. So if you hear like a slight little snoring, that is a 20-pound pug that obviously has a little bit of trouble breathing. So I apologize for the background noise. That's what you get when you listen to indie podcasts. We keep it very, very real. So I just want to call that out because I thought that was really funny. When I listened back, I was like, oh shit. But it was such a big part of the episode that I couldn't go back and re-record it. And also I didn't really hear it until I listened like on Spotify. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed or weren't too concerned as to what the hell was going on. But yeah, I thought it was funny. Anyway, week's been kind of boring for me, still getting over being sick, which is insane. But I think I'm just going to jump into this new episode. I am doing another doozy. I'm trying to go back and forth with like a shorter tale, a longer tale, mixing it up. And this week I am doing the story of the girl in the box. Now, this is not a story of murder. It's a survival story. And sometimes I feel like survival stories are the worst ones because you get to hear all the details because the person who suffered all of these things remembers them. And I'm glad for any time that somebody survives, obviously, but it really, it's hard when you know that somebody is walking around living their life having dealt with what they dealt with. So this is going to be a pretty gnarly one. I tried to put in good detail without going so granular that we're here for 3 episodes. Hopefully this mix works. And for those of you who know the case, I hope you enjoy my version of it. For those of you who don't know the case, sit tight, hold on to your butts. What movie is that from? Anyway, here we go. This story actually begins in Eugene, Oregon, which is another place I used to live, so I love that tie-in. Colleen Stan was born on New Year's Eve in 1956, but raised at least in part in Southern California. Her parents divorced when she was pretty young, and she ended up with a few half-siblings as a result, as well as, I believe, 2 full-blooded sisters. She was close with both parents, but seemingly a bit closer to her dad. Colleen lived a fairly tough life, though she was a very nice person. She had a really loving family, but I don't think they had a lot of money, and I think they were very working class. So Colleen maybe didn't have as much direction in her life. And so at a fairly young age, she got into drugs, not anything crazy, but she definitely had a little bit of a past there. And by the time she was 16, she was already married and divorced when she turned 20. So to kind of protect the privacy of her family, and I think you can find, her true maiden name, but most reports refer to her as Colleen Martin, and that her family are the Martin family. That's not actually their true last name, but it's what most people go with. So the last name Stan was actually her first husband's last name. So even though she was divorced, she kept his last name. She was known as Colleen Stan. So after getting divorced, I think she's a little aimless, not really sure what to do. But when she was 19 or 20, she met a couple named Alice and Bob, and they had a young child, and they were going to move up to Eugene or move back to Eugene. And she decided to move with them. After the move, she was left, a little aimless again. The job market wasn't great, so she was kind of struggling. I believe she did have a boyfriend and like a pretty good life, but just very kind of not a lot going on. In May of 1977, Colleen decided to go surprise her friend for her birthday. This friend, Linda, lived in Westwood, a tiny town in Northern California. It's not even a town. It's like a designated area. It's about 100 miles east of Red Bluff, which is about an hour north of Sacramento. So she's really like, Westwood is like really just kind of out in the middle of nowhere. It's like no services, no there weren't cell phones back then, but even now, I doubt there's like cell service out there. It very, very isolated, very desolate, very, mountain people kind of living. So she had a car, but it wasn't in any condition to drive her out of state. So she decided instead to hitchhike, which was very common at the time. Her roommates did not love this plan, but eventually agreed to drive her to the freeway, where she quickly got a few rides that brought her within about 100 miles of her destination. So she basically just went down the 5 freeway and ended up right in Red Bluff, California. Now, while she was in Red Bluff, she turned down a couple of rides. One was from like a really creepy guy, and one was a car full of hippies that were all men, which made her nervous because she was like, I can't get into a car with a bunch of dudes. Like, that's dangerous. Finally, a couple in a blue Dodge Colt stopped, and this couple was a man and a woman with a small child, like maybe right around a year old. This put Colleen at ease because, like, there's a mother and a baby in the car. What's the worst that could happen? And she decided to get in the back of the car. Now, while in the car, she noticed there was a wooden box about the size of like a milk crate on the seat next to her. She didn't pay a lot of attention to it. It's not really her business, mostly because, it's just, who cares? It's a box in a car. Like, why would she think anything of it? But the other reason that she was sort of distracted was that she kept noticing the driver of the car looking back at her in the rearview mirror. Now, this unnerved her a bit, but not enough that she wanted to get out of the car. And besides, she was really close to her destination, and they were going to get there in like an hour or two. So she was just like stoked. She was like, I'm almost there. Like, it's worth it. I'll just sit tight. Like, what's the worst that could happen? Famous last words. Now, at one point, they all stopped for gas, and Colleen went in to use the restroom. She later said that she had a feeling of fear come over her, and a voice in her head told her to run for her life. She even thought about climbing out of the tiny window in the bathroom so she could disappear without being seen. But for whatever reason, she shook this feeling off and got back in the car with the couple and their baby. This was a mistake that would change the course of her life forever. As they drove on, the man who was driving began asking Colleen questions. Did she have a boyfriend? Where was she going? Was she expected? Colleen answered mostly truthfully, which was, in my opinion, another mistake. She even told them that her friend she was going to visit was not expecting her and didn't have a phone, so she couldn't call or be called. So even if her friend was expecting her, it would have taken a while for her to alert Colleen's family of anything being wrong. But the fact that she didn't even know Colleen was coming meant there were going to be multiple days before anybody realized anything. Now, before she left, Colleen did tell her roommates and boyfriend that she would be back on Saturday. She left on a Thursday. So she was really trying to just do a quick turnaround trip, one day with her friend, and come back. But with no way to check in with this friend, Linda, again, her disappearance would go unnoticed a bit longer than most. As they continued to drive, the man made a suggestion to stop and see some caves in the area. He asked Colleen if she would mind, and though she kind of did mind, she didn't want to be difficult, so she agreed to stop and at least let them get out and look. Shortly thereafter, the car pulled over near some woods and a creek, but seemingly not near any caves, which, red flag, and the couple got out of the car. Now, Colleen waited inside, and after a minute, the woman and baby disappeared into the woods, seemingly down by the creek. Colleen was still kind of craning her neck to see where they went from the back seat when suddenly the man jumped into the back seat with her and pressed a knife to her throat. He ordered Colleen to put her hands above her head, and when she hesitated, he pressed the knife harder against her throat. She did as she was told, and the man quickly put handcuffs on her after pulling her hands behind her back. He then blindfolded and gagged her, tied her ankles, and then, in a horrifying move, he placed that wooden box that had been in the back seat onto her head. The box had a hole in the bottom, and when it opened, the hole split into two like semicircles, so it basically hinged open and then hinged back shut onto her head and was locked with a metal lock. Now, when this box was closed, it was super tight and pinched her neck and made her feel like she couldn't breathe. This box also weighed about 20 pounds and was insulated and carpeted, which is really weird and also very disgusting. So like I said, she was gagged, blindfolded, tied up with this box on her head, so tight that she thought she might suffocate. She was also in the pitch black. The claustrophobia she must have felt like I cannot even imagine. The man then made her lie down in the back seat and put her sleeping bag, which she had brought with her, over her body. Though the box was mostly soundproofed, she could still hear a little bit, and she heard the woman and baby get back into the car. They then started driving, though Colleen had no idea where they were going. Eventually, she was able to hear other cars, meaning they were heading back into the city, likely Red Bluff, or at least some city. At one point during the drive, she felt something heavy on her body and quickly realized it was the baby. They straight up put their baby on top of her as if she was furniture. The baby began to cry, so they moved her off of Colleen and continued driving. It's so fucking weird. Colleen was sweating profusely this entire time. In May in Northern California, it's pretty hot. And, she had this insulated box on her head and a sleeping bag over her entire head and body. So she's just extremely uncomfortable, terrified. It's just horrifying. After what felt like hours, Colleen heard the car stop and heard the woman get out. A few minutes later, the woman came back and Colleen could smell food and realized the couple were sitting in their car eating burgers and fries, it just feels psychotic to have somebody in the back of your car with a box on their head, bound and gagged, and you're just having some fast food. It's so twisted. What the couple was doing was killing time, waiting for nightfall so that they could take Colleen out of the car and into their home at 1140 Oak Street in Red Bluff. Now, I want to take a moment here to sidebar. I used to drive from Bend, Oregon down to Los Angeles a few times a month, actually, for a while for work. And one time I brought my family with, and we decided to stay the night somewhere so we didn't have to do the 18-hour drive all in one stretch. I guess it's closer to 12 hours. But in any case, we decided to stay the night, and we stayed in Red Bluff. And I knew about this case, so I looked up the address where it took place, and I went to see the house. And this house is so nondescript. The people living there now have young children, which I guess is the same as this couple. There were bicycles in the yard. It's a really cute house. You can definitely tell that there's a basement, which I'll talk about. But it was really weird because it's a pretty modest house. And right next to it is an old Victorian home that was really beautiful. And anybody who knows me knows that I'm a thrift store and garage sale freak. And there happened to be a garage sale going on at the house next door. So I stopped and I ended up buying a Budweiser bowling ball from the 80s from this neighbor. And this neighbor, they had told me that they lived in the neighborhood. It was their parents' house. So these people almost for sure lived next to this couple while Colleen Stan was their kidnapped victim, hostage, and as we'll see, slave. So I just wanted to call that out because it was such a crazy experience for me, and also kind of funny that I bought a bowling ball to commemorate the occasion. Anyway, so I just wanted to kind of call that out. So now they're at the house, and the man unties Colleen's feet so that she can walk, and also removes the head box, but everything else stays in place. So she's still gagged, blindfolded, and her hands are handcuffed behind her back. She's led down to the basement. And the woman and baby go upstairs, but the man comes down with her. So she's now alone with him. This man first handcuffs her to a pipe, then undresses her, and then puts her hands into these kind of stiff homemade leather cuffs, which he then hooks to the ceiling. Colleen was made to stand on what she later found out was an ice chest and was spread with her arms almost in a Y shape, almost like if she was on a crucifix. So her arms are up above her head to the sides, pardon me, and she's standing on an ice chest. The man then kicked the ice chest out from under her feet. Colleen, still blindfolded and gagged, felt immediate, intense pain in her wrists and shoulders. Searing, horrifying pain. So she began to struggle and kick and look for anything to put under her feet. Suddenly, the pain in her arms was accompanied by a searing pain across first her back and then her stomach, as the man whipped her with a leather whip while telling her to stop moving and be still. And he sounded murderous. He was like, you stop or I will never stop whipping you. Like, he was relentless. Finally, somehow, she is able to force herself to stop moving despite the horrific pain that she's in. She is able to just somehow calm her body and stop moving. And eventually he put the chest back under her feet. Now, to be clear, this type of hanging can suffocate you if you're left too long. And I think this man knew that, and so he would always time it so it was maximum pain, maximum suffering, but never causing death or even loss of consciousness, I think, due to hanging. Although I do know that she lost consciousness from time to time, but maybe not from the hanging, probably from the pain, because this is fucking horrific. The man then left Colleen alone, sobbing silently into her blindfold and still with her arms over her head, and the man went upstairs. Before long, he was back with the woman, and Colleen could see through like the bottom of her blindfold. She could barely see out of it. And she saw them doing something extremely disturbing. The two laid down on the ground at her feet on the floor of the basement and had sex while she remained strung up, naked, and helpless. Once they were done, the woman went back upstairs and the man took Colleen down. He then put her into a box that was roughly square and about 3 feet tall. It did have one opening on it so that he could like access her, but it was otherwise enclosed, and she was made to sit in there. And I'll explain in a second. So he removed her gag, and the moment she could speak, she began begging him to let her go. Unfortunately, this was cut short by him putting what she later learned was called the head box back on her head and snapping it shut. He then chained it and her hands to the top of the box, so she was forced to sit up with her hands above her head with this suffocating box on her head as well. The man then left her in the box, and Colleen, of course, began to panic. Her breathing was extremely labored, and she felt that she would certainly die if someone didn't help her and if she didn't get air. As a result, she began thrashing around the box, and finally, after what felt like forever, the man came back down. He angrily asked her what the problem was, and she said she couldn't breathe and it hurt so much to have her hands over her head. She begged him to let her take her hands down. In response, this horrible, horrible man not only did not remove the box, he instead decided to increase her pain and suffering by tying a strap around her ribs to the point where she felt they would break. It further restricted her breathing. So she's telling him, I think I'm going to die. I can't breathe. And he puts this around her to make it even harder. He then shut the box back up and left her for the night. So let's talk about this piece of shit. Cameron Hooker was 19 years old when he met a very shy 15-year-old girl named Janice. Cameron was born and raised in Red Bluff and had been a very uninteresting person in high school. He wasn't good at sports, didn't have great grades, and definitely was not very good looking. Basically, he was just a social outcast. But nobody ever said anything weird about him. He seemed like a perfectly normal person, just completely uninteresting and sort of a wallflower. Once he graduated, he went to work at the nearby mill, which was the biggest employer in Red Bluff. And while working at the mill, he was introduced to Janice, who was still in junior high, mind you. The two began dating, and Janice fell head over heels in love. She was essentially him as a girl, unremarkable, unimportant, unnoticed by most. So when Cameron at first lavished her with attention, it became like a drug to her, which is probably why, when Cameron eventually asked her to engage in bondage with him, she agreed, even though she really didn't want to. He started slow, but eventually he was hanging her from trees, tying her up, hurting and scaring her, but she always allowed it because she loved him and because he would be so tender with her once he was done. So this went on for about a year, and finally the two were married, And after that, the abuse only escalated, though never as a result of anger. You see, Cameron had always been into bondage, even in high school. He would buy and obsess over bondage magazines and would replicate what he saw in them with Jan. After a while, Cameron seemed to grow bored of having sex with Janice in this way and began asking if she'd be open to bringing in another woman. Now, Jan really did not want to do this, but she was so in love with and now somewhat afraid of Cameron, and she also didn't want to be in this pain anymore. It was unbearable. Hanging by her wrists, being hit with the whip, like she knew that it wasn't in anger, but it didn't matter. Like, it was abuse and she didn't love it. So Cameron wanting to bring in another woman was not in the traditional sense of like, a throuple, what we call a throuple now. Cameron told her that he wanted a slave, and in fact, a sex slave. Someone who couldn't say no, someone who had no choice but to give in to all of his fantasies. At first, Janice, like I said, very against this. But as she thought about it more, she realized it would take a lot of the abuse off of her, and also she could use his request as a bargaining chip. Finally, Jan agreed, but only if Cameron would let her have a baby. Because this is a great situation to bring a child into, right? Like, let's get a slave and a baby. So at this point, she's either 17 or maybe 18, so still very young. But even so, like, talk about making bad decisions, right? Janice pretty quickly became pregnant, and meanwhile, Cameron set about preparing for his slave. He built out the aforementioned boxes, shored up the basement, and basically just got ready for an attack. But it kept not happening. He kept trying to find someone, and it kept not working out. Janice gave birth, and still Cameron had not been able to find the slave. He even stalked a few women, but to no avail. Finally, on May 17th, 1977, he met Colleen Stan, and he and Jan put the plan into place, and that brings us back to Colleen in the box. Now, she wasn't always in the box at first. In fact, she was most often left hanging on the wall, standing on the ice chest, so not like fully hanging, still blindfolded and gagged, and her head still in the box. And this would happen for about 23 hours a day. The only time she was freed was after the Hooker family had had dinner, and Cameron came down to attack her. He would beat her, whip her, otherwise abuse her, and then eventually feed her some meager scraps. She was given 1 meal per day, usually leftovers from the family dinner, and water, and nothing else. Now, she was about, I think, 5'6" and maybe 135 pounds, and eventually she got down to under 100 pounds at one point, living with this family. So she was really on like a starvation diet. She was not given enough food, enough nutrition. Colleen always had really beautiful, thick hair. It ended up becoming thin and dull. Her skin was sallow. She just looked terrible. In addition to this, she was left with no access to a bathroom and would often soil herself, which angered Cameron, who would punish her with whippings and beatings. She still had no idea who these people were, but after a few weeks, her situation did improve slightly, as she was allowed to sleep in the box without the head box on. So she was then allowed to sleep in a 3-foot by 3-foot by 3-foot, a 3-foot cube, essentially. But she didn't have the head box on, so at least there was that. And she wasn't hanging on the wall the whole time. She was still beaten, hung, and I hadn't mentioned this yet, but she was also photographed extensively while in these situations. But at night, she had her sleeping bag in this tiny box and could actually sleep some. In fact, she now spent most of her time in this box only coming out for food and abuse. But it was far, far better than being strung up all day, every day. She was still blindfolded and hadn't had use of her eyes besides to peer out of the tiny slit in the blindfold for weeks and weeks. But again, at least the head box was gone. Now, Colleen stopped having her period at this time because she lost so much weight. And she also had not showered since being taken. She was in this captivity living like this for 3 months before she was finally allowed to bathe. But even this turned into a form of torture by her captor. When she finally was given the opportunity to bathe, she was taken up to the bathroom, blindfold still on, and Cameron, without warning, shoved her face under the water and held it there until she nearly died. When he removed her face, she gasped for air and felt pain in her lungs, probably because she had sucked in water. He then dunked her in a similar way multiple times before actually allowing her to bathe. This was just another form of torture and his way of reinforcing that he was in charge and that the only reason she was even getting to bathe was because he allowed her to, and he could kill her anytime he wanted. Even after the shower, her hair was too matted to brush out, so Jan cut over 6 inches off, leaving her formerly thick waist-length hair just above her shoulders. She had also poured cooking oil into it to try to get the mats out. That's how bad it was, and that did not work. So now she has her hair's chopped off, it's full of oil, it's just a disgusting situation. Now this went on for months, living blindfolded in the box, no clue who her captors were, tortured daily, barely fed. But I do want to note, to this point, she had not been actually raped. Not yet, anyway. Now, finally, after about 6 months, Cameron decided that he wanted to put Colleen to work. And this is the first time her blindfold was removed since she was taken. She lived with a blindfold on for 6 months straight. Whatever the reason Cameron decided to give her sight back, she was ecstatic. Her first job, so she was basically, he decided he's going to let her see again because he wants to put her to work. That being said, her very first job, she still wasn't able to see. She was to sand down a piece of wood that Cameron was going to fashion into either a carving or a tool, which he was then going to sell for extra money. This she actually did with another box on her head, which was larger and heavier than the first. And because of this, she wasn't able to lift her head because it's, the other one was 20 pounds. If this one's heavier than that, there's no way she's going to be able to hold it up without using her hands. Cameron quickly realized this, so he fashioned a pulley system for her, and she worked while still being blindfolded and in the box. Eventually, though, the box was removed and she was made to work in a tiny wood shop box wherein she would do menial tasks like shelling nuts, crocheting items for the family to sell, and other small jobs. So basically like the definition of slave labor. But she did have more room in this workshop box. So for her situation had once again slightly improved, which is a very sad way to look at it, but it was something. She could see, she had more room to move, and she had something to do. She wasn't just sitting there in isolation with her mind just being, just shut in darkness all the time, which is so, so bad for your mental health and just your sense of self. I mean, it's horrifying. And I don't think it was an accident that he isolated her for so long before starting to have her do things for him. I think it was all part of his plan to manipulate and control her. And to that point, the hangings, beatings, and assaults continued during this time. But again, she's given a task. So now I want to take a moment to talk about the psychological effects of being in this type of deprivation for so long. Many states have limited how long a person can be in solitary confinement to between 15 and 20 days and have outlawed it for multiple groups of people, including children, which obviously, and disabled people, which is kind of another obvious one. Other states have outlawed it entirely, and unfortunately some have not outlawed it at all. But the idea that so many have, and that there's a general consensus that you can't keep people like this for, months and months and years at a time, just goes to show how terrible this is for your mental health. If actual prisons are like, oh yeah, that's too far, it's cruel and unusual punishment. And to be clear, solitary confinement is not even as bad as what Colleen went through. What Colleen went through was a total loss of any sort of stimulation for months on end. And the only thing that she knew was like isolation and pain and darkness. So to say that this will mess with a person's mind is a vast understatement. To Cameron, the idea of breaking someone was beyond his wildest dreams, and I hate to say it, but he was very good at this. This was one of the only things that he was actually good at, which is not a flex in any way. The fact that Colleen later said that she felt grateful for the freedom, grateful to Cameron, is a prime example of how this sort of brainwashing occurs, and it's really sick. So pretty quickly after Colleen started this new pattern of working in the tiny workshop box and being able to see for most of the day, things changed again. Cameron and Jan, whose names Colleen had finally learned over time, had been able to buy themselves a plot of land nearby, still in Red Bluff, but more on the outskirts, away from neighbors and prying eyes. And they put a single-wide trailer out there for themselves to live in. Around this time, a little bit later, like once they moved, Jan also became pregnant again. So everything is changing. They moved into the trailer and, of course, brought Colleen with them. Cameron did what he could to remove the evidence of her captivity in the basement from the rented house and was pretty successful as nobody asked any questions. So they sort of got away with it, at least to that point. Now they were away from their neighbors. They didn't have to be scared to whip and torture Colleen. Like, they could make all the noise they wanted, even though at this point she'd been trained to be quiet and had also made sort of a promise to herself that she wouldn't cry. But they were definitely more free to do with her what they wanted. There was one problem. Where was she going to sleep without a basement? A trailer, a double wide, or a single wide, does not have a basement. Cameron's answer was crazy, but it worked. He built a box that basically slid in and out from under the bed, like a pull-out drawer or like a bottom freezer. This box was long enough for Colleen to lie down in fully and just wide enough for her to sort of move around if she needed to. She was given a bedpan, and there was an old hairdryer set on cold that would circulate the air day in and day out. It didn't cool the air, it just kind of moved it, so on hot days she would be sweating profusely, thinking she might die of heat stroke. And at this point, she went back to spending about 23 hours a day in this box. Fairly slowly, I feel like every time something changed, the answer was to stick her back in the box and just torture her, kind of like ground zero again, right? Finally, though, she was allowed out and started helping around the house, even babysitting the two young girls. Now, before we get too much into that, I'm going to go back for a second here to discuss how Colleen was given this new freedom without Cameron and Jan being terrified that she would run away. The answer was simple. Cameron made Colleen a slave contract and told her a really crazy tale about an international group of super powerful men who had slaves all over the world. This group was called The Company, and according to Cameron, they were everywhere. His father and brother, who she would occasionally hear come in and out of the house, were supposedly in this group, as were many police officers and people of high-ranking status, as well as people in the city of Red Bluff. Now, according to Cameron, these people were all powerful. They were able to get away with anything because they had so many, police and lawyers and judges and politicians on their payroll. He told her stories of people who had attempted to escape before, like slaves that had tried to get away from the company, and the horrible things that would happen to them. He said one woman escaped, and when she was caught, first her fingers were surgically removed without anesthesia, then her hands, then her arms, then her legs. He said she was tied up by her hair and hung in her master's bedroom for a year until she finally died. He also told her that Janice was a former slave and that she had been in trouble for, again, trying to run away. So they had done something really horrible to her that resulted in her knees having terrible scars on them. In reality, Janice had had to have knee surgery. But he kind of used this to sell this lie and said that they were going to kill Janice, but he took pity on her and married her. So she was a former slave that was now his wife. And this sort of also explained why she was subjected to some of this bondage in the same way, because it just made sense. Like, she was a former slave. She was used to it. That's why this worked out, right? Anyway, the contract itself was horrifying on top of all else, and noted that she was only to ever call him master and never by his name. It basically said that she was his slave forever, would always obey, would never run away or try for help, which would be dangerous anyway, according to Cameron, because you never know who's in the company, and would essentially give her life over to Cameron entirely. Colleen, horrified at this, and still not fully brainwashed at this point, because it was still pretty early on, she asked, what happens if I refuse to sign? Cameron said, well, I'm just going to sign for you anyway, and I'll make you wish you had. So basically, under threat of, violence, she signed. And from there on out, she was given a little bit more freedom. Not exactly at first, but once Cameron felt the contract and the idea of the company had really soaked in, he started allowing her these freedoms that I was sort of talking about. She was also given a slave name, K Powers, and that's just the letter K. And later on, I'm going to touch on just a little bit the story of O, which is one of his favorite books, and very much aligns with like what he's doing. Also on this contract, he was called Michael Powers and Janice was called Janet Powers. Even after signing, Cameron continued to terrify Colleen with tales of the company, saying their headquarters were in Sacramento, so not even far away, and that everyone was in their group and on their payroll. Now, after she signed, she was given a slave collar to wear around her neck, and so began her life as Kay, the house slave. Also, before their move to the trailer, Colleen experienced her first rape by Cameron. And I hadn't touched on this before, but part of the deal between Cameron and Jan was that he could keep a sex slave, but he was not allowed to actually have sex with her. The sex was only for him and Jan. Now, weirdly, Jan is actually religious, which, like, I realize how weird that sounds. But I honestly think it had a little bit more to do with jealousy than anything. And that was sort of just her excuse because she just didn't want him having sex with other women because in all of this, Jan is still very insecure. I mean, the things she lets him do to her are, a sign of that, obviously. In any case, Cameron decided to just try it anyway. A few nights before they moved, Cameron brought Colleen up to the bedroom and had both women lay with him naked. He started kind of with Jan and then moved on to Colleen. And as he began raping Colleen, Jan got up, clearly upset, and went to get dressed. Cameron ended up stopping, grabbing Jan and calming her down. He then kind of put an end to the whole thing and put Colleen back in the basement. Didn't try this again for a while, but the damage was definitely done. And the relationship between Jan and Kay was changed from that moment. Like they didn't really have much of a relationship at this point because Colleen was just being abused. But now Jan had like a hatred for her, which is really frustrating because it's Cameron that she should hate. And I think in a lot of points she did, but again, she felt helpless and she was still kind of wanting his affection. I think that was sort of the nature of their relationship. So the only thing she really could do was hate Colleen, and she definitely did. So again, this is a big part of why I think she ended up back in a box 23 hours a day, whereas she had started to get a little bit of freedom. It was sort of in reaction to Jan's response to that situation. During these first few months in the new trailer, Colleen spent these 23 hours a day in a box. The box was actually smaller than the first one since it had to fit under the bed. And she was only allowed to shower every 2 or so weeks. So every 2 to 3 weeks, she would get a shower. And she was regularly tortured. And around this time, the torture really ramped up, I think, as part of her having to sort of regain their trust, even though she didn't do anything wrong. He would also hang her by her wrists, and he actually hadn't done this in a while, so she began writhing in pain because she was, like, it had been a few months since he had done this to her, and as a result, she just wasn't used to it. So to stop her from moving around, he tied something very heavy to her legs, which only made the pain worse. When Colleen continued to move, basically uncontrollably, he went and got matches and burned her with them. And he burned her breasts. And she had scars for the rest of her life. She still has scars to this day. Now, after their second little girl was born, Jan ended up going back to work because the family needed money. Cameron mostly worked nights, so during the day when Jan was gone, he would take Colleen out of the box more and more. And in part, this was to do chores and watch the young girls, which Cameron definitely lied to Jan about, but it was also to torture and rape her. And this is when the rapes became more consistent because Jan was gone. So Cameron could get away with it. And he obviously had no respect for her and just wanted to do whatever he wanted to do. So as long as she was out of the house, he was free to fully sexually abuse Colleen, in addition to the torture. This all started about 1979, and the girls were, I think, about under a year and about 3 years old. So very young, and Colleen was like a mother to them during this time. She would always disappear when Jan came home, and Cameron would, of course, only admit to having her cook dinner. But later on we found out that she was basically like a mother, and in fact, sometimes the little girls would call her mommy, which is just so fucked up. About this time, Cameron also built a new torture device called the stretcher. Now, this was a fucking medieval torture device that they used to use in medieval times to tear people apart. And Cameron used this on Colleen, pulling her body tighter and tighter. He did this constantly. This was like his favorite new torture device. He even told her, "I'm not doing this because I'm angry at you. I'm doing this because I like it." It's absolutely disgusting. The first time he used it, he pulled her so tightly that he popped her shoulder out of place. He dislocated it and also broke one of the wrist straps. At this point, Cameron forced Colleen to try to beg for mercy, but Colleen was in so much pain, she could barely whimper. From there, Cameron was so turned on that he forced her to give him oral sex and then threw her back into the box. So this was the type of thing that she was subjected to every single day while Jan was away at work. Things went on like this for a while, but eventually the couple started letting Colleen out of her box more and more while both of them were home, allowing her more time out to do chores and to care for the girls, which Jan didn't love but was getting more used to. At one point, they even asked her what she wanted for her birthday, and having not celebrated a single thing in the 3 years she'd been in captivity, she asked for only a Bible, which she was granted. The reason she asked for this is she felt that the only thing she had in her life keeping her going was God, and she wanted to strengthen her relationship with him. Shortly thereafter, Jan lost her job and things were tight for the family, so Cameron was trying to figure out ways to use Colleen to make money. He took her first to Vegas, forcing her to panhandle, and then he had her do it 2 other times, including in Red Bluff. However, this wasn't as lucrative as he had hoped, so he kind of put an end to it. Jan actually got another job after a while, and at that point, Colleen was more free. She was given more freedom, so she was sort of more officially taking care of the girls and basically just like a regular part of life. The girls knew who she was. She was known as Kay. So things were starting to really form as basically she was just like a slave. Like she was out most of the time, but doing cooking, cleaning, childcare, all of that. Now, as time went on, more people moved into the neighborhood and Cameron's family started coming over regularly. So Cameron decided to say that Colleen was a live-in babysitter who helped around the house, which was a half truth. This seemed to quell any questions neighbors had, as she now regularly worked in the garden, planting and tending to food-producing plants, also cooking and cleaning, caring for the children, all the things I kind of talked about. At one point, for no reason she could come up with, Cameron even let Colleen write a letter to her sister, Bonnie. Now, Colleen had been asking and asking and asking, and finally he said yes. But he had told her over and over, like, the company won't let you do it. The company won't let you do it. Finally, he was like, yeah, the company agreed and let her write a letter. Now, the letter, of course, had to be very vague and only say, you know, I'm living with a family up north. I'm okay. Everything's great. But it was a huge thing because this was the first time in almost 4 years that her family had heard from her, and they had been looking for her the entire time. Her family thought she was dead or thought she could be. So this was a huge thing for her to be able to reach out and let them know she was in fact alive. Shortly after this, Colleen, I think kind of sensing that she had a little bit more trust, kept pushing and was finally allowed to call and speak to her family. Though again, Cameron stood there, listened in, and was like, you say one wrong thing, the company's going to kill your whole family. So she called and it was her sister Bonnie who answered, and they had like a 5-minute conversation. Bonnie later said she sounded quiet and aloof and wouldn't give any real answers as to where she was or what she was doing. Cameron was playing a very dangerous game here, but also sort of testing the waters to see how much control he had over Colleen, and it was quite a lot. Now from here, Colleen sort of kept pushing and kind of asking to see her family. Like, can I go see my family? And at first Cameron was like, absolutely not. No slave has ever been able to do this. We're never going to let that happen. But eventually, at the end of 1980, he told her the company said okay and that he could take her down to see her family in Riverside. Now, prior to this is what Colleen later called her year out. This was a year where her life was almost normal, or at least outwardly. She was given permission to go on jogs, though Cameron and Jan timed her jog to ensure she wasn't even a minute late each time. She was allowed to go outside. She talked to neighbors. She was basically just a part of the family, at least to outsiders. She also was not being sexually assaulted as much, like not nearly as much, and also not tortured very much. She was sort of allowed to just exist in like a service role, an unpaid sort of service role. Jan was very unhappy with this arrangement, both morally, because she had always kind of had a problem with Colleen being a slave, which is like fair, she should have had a much bigger problem with it, but at least she felt a little bad. But I think even more so out of jealousy. Colleen was pretty much now on the same level as Jan, except that she slept in a box under the bed and Jan was allowed to like tell her what to do. They both took care of the girls. They both did suffer some amount of sexual abuse. They both did housework and they both did whatever Cameron told them to do. So it was a very similar thing. This caused the women to bicker and fight constantly, with Colleen feeling confident enough to even complain about Jan to Cameron. The other part of this is that, so Cameron was making Colleen keep record, like keep a diary, and write about her experiences as being his slave. Colleen, attempting to sort of appease Cameron or gain favor with him, would write fantastical shit about how she loved Cameron and how she wanted to be his slave, pretending that she didn't know he was going to read it, so like these are her inner thoughts and Cameron's reading them and like, oh, she loves me. Oh, she thinks I'm so great. And this worked. Like a lot of the torture was shorter. It was less intense. It happened less often the more she wrote about how much she loved Cameron. So this manipulation was great, except that Jan got a hold of the diary and read it and believed what Colleen was writing. So Jan believed that Colleen was in love with Cameron, and this made her very angry and very jealous and put a huge strain on their relationship. Jan also read at this time that Cameron had been raping Colleen, although Colleen, I think, wrote about it in that they were having sex. So Jan had been lied to this whole time and just found this out. And again, instead of being upset with Cameron, she was upset with Colleen. So they had been fighting for like an entire year, and Cameron was like, I cannot deal with this anymore. Now, I don't know if he told Colleen what was going to happen, but in his mind, he decided it was time for Colleen to go back in the box full time. Now, right before he decided to put her away, he told her, I'm going to take you to see your family. So what he did is he had her say goodbye to the girls. He had her say goodbye to the neighbors. He told everybody that she was going to go back down to Riverside to live with her family. She was done working for them, right? So this is how he sort of made the excuse that she was going to disappear. Before he took her to see her family, he made her do a bunch of tests to prove herself. And these tests included putting a shotgun in her mouth and pulling the trigger. Now, the shotgun wasn't loaded, but this was Cameron's way of continuing to break her down mentally and also test her loyalty. He also strung her up in the barn at her dad's house and was about to torture her when his dad came home and caught her putting her clothes back on. For whatever reason, this was never spoken about, but it was yet another test. And then he did take her down to see her family. Now, before he did this, he took her to Sacramento, where he went into the supposed headquarters of the company. And what he did, he just walked into like a high rise in Sacramento, like some building, and just like probably walked around for 20 minutes and then came back. So what he was doing here was just reinforcing her fears and making sure she didn't betray him. He was also, again, testing to see how far he could push this without getting caught, right? So he did this, and then he took her to see her family, and he actually dropped her off, and she spent just about 24 hours with her family without Cameron. She was so happy. She told her family she loved them so many times. She just was like ecstatic, but she never told them anything about what was going on for fear of being killed. Now, at one point, she's with her family, and Cameron calls and says, I'm going to be there in 15 minutes. When he arrived at the house, he introduced himself to her father and sisters as Mike, Colleen's fiance. He said very little, only that they needed to get going and that they couldn't give an address or phone number as they were in the middle of a move, but they would reach out once they were settled. They then left and drove back to Red Bluff. During the car ride, Colleen began sobbing uncontrollably, and when Cameron asked her if she had a good time, she said, yes, it was wonderful. Thank you so much, Master, for allowing me to see my family. From here began maybe the worst 3 years of her captivity. She spent 3 years being stuck inside this box, barely bigger than herself, with nothing but darkness and a tiny hole to peer out of from under the bed. Colleen suffered urinary tract infections. She was sick. She got strep throat. And Cameron refused to do anything to help her. So she had to sweat out these infections and luckily did not die from them. But she was left in this box 23 hours a day. When she was taken out, she was beaten and tortured severely, like worse than she had ever been. She was in the dark for so long that her skin turned nearly white and her hair started to fall out. She was only fed 4 or 5 meals per day, and at one point, once again, she got down to under 100 pounds. She was extremely sick. One weekend, Cameron and Jan left for the entire weekend and left her in the box with no food or water. When they came back, she was so weak she could barely stand and almost died. One time, in a fit of anger, Colleen kicked out the bottom of the box. Not realizing she was strong enough to do so, she laid there in fear, trembling, wondering what Cameron would do when he came home. She did not run away because she was afraid of what would happen to her and what the company would do to her. When Cameron got home, weirdly, he was not upset and he just fixed the box and put her back in it. That was really it. So I think one of the craziest things about him and the way that he acted was it was completely unpredictable. And I think that was a big part of the fear and the control that he had over her. She didn't ever know what to expect. Now, also during this time, Cameron had an idea to put a dungeon under the shed outside. And he and Colleen would spend hours digging this hole. And this was essentially the only thing that she could do while she was in the box. To get out was to go dig this hole, which is probably very difficult for her considering she was like slowly starving to death. So to put forward this much energy was probably pretty crazy, but at least she was out of the box. Now, once the hole was large enough, they also put concrete blocks in it to make it like a room. Now, Cameron said he wanted to kidnap more slaves, and Colleen knew that that meant she was going to have to abuse those women when they came under his control, and she was terrified because she saw what Jan was doing to her, and she just figured it would be sort of like top-down kind of thing. Now, they got this built out, and Colleen was allowed to live in there, and it was a huge improvement over the box because she could stand up, she could sit down, she could move around. It was outside, but at least she was free. She was in the dark, she was underground, but she was free. Cameron had put like a, plywood over it and then something heavy on it so she couldn't get out, but it was far, far better than the tiny little dungeon that she'd been in. Now, unfortunately, by the time they finished building this out, it was wintertime and the rains came. And despite Cameron's best efforts, the hole started to fill up with water. And the water got to Colleen's knees before Cameron finally let her out and brought her back inside and unfortunately put her back in the box. So I think Cameron was really upset about this because his idea was to build multiple rooms. And when they had dug out this dungeon, they started to dig out sort of like a walkway almost to get to the next dungeon that they were going to build so that he could fill his yard with slaves, which is absolutely fucking insane. Now, during this time, Cameron also continued to rape Colleen, and Jan, again, like he told her, okay, I'd been doing it for a while, I'm not going to do it anymore, and she found out again. And the worst thing for Cameron about Jan finding out again was that she began to feel bad for Colleen and to blame Cameron for his actions. Finally, this is all starting to boil over. And I don't know if I mentioned this, I don't believe I did, but there were at least 2 times that Jan had left Cameron during these years because she was so upset about what was going on. Now, she had gone to live with her sister, I believe, both times. And, it didn't last more than like a weekend, maybe a week at most. But it goes to show the inner turmoil that she was facing and that she was not happy with this, even though I don't really feel super sorry for her because she let this go on and she, of course, had a choice. but it just goes to show that she has something of a conscience. And so when she kind of starts to realize that Colleen, she's almost dead, in this box and still being sexually assaulted, I think something just sort of clicked inside of Jan, and she just started to feel bad for Colleen. So now we're at the end of 1984. Colleen is turning 27 years old, and it's been about 2.5, almost 3 years that she has just been in isolation. She had a very short amount of time in the dungeon, and otherwise she's just been in the box pretty much near death. On the night of her birthday, which is New Year's Eve, Cameron and Jan bring her out of the box. They take her into the kitchen, and they have a cake. They have a fucking birthday cake waiting for her. This woman that has been abused to the brink of death for years now. They're like, come into the kitchen. We're going to sing you happy birthday. And they did. They sang her happy birthday. They all had cake together. And from there, Colleen again began to see more freedom. So the pendulum swings. She was on lockdown. Then she got a bunch of freedom. Back to lockdown. Now the freedom's coming back again. At first, the freedom only really came at night, but eventually she's given not just the same freedoms that she had, but far more. Cameron not only reintroduced her to his daughters, but also to the neighbors, saying like, look who's back. And Jan did the same things, as though Kay, had chosen to come back to work for the family once again. At this time, along with her freedom, her relationship with Jan also began to grow, and they eventually came to consider each other their best friends. Like they were each other's best friends. They were also each other's only friends for reasons that I think we can all understand. The two of them bonded over reading the Bible, which Cameron allowed because he would then use passages as a means of controlling the women, either by like misquoting it or by using quotes about like obeying their husband, even though, Colleen's not married to him, but it's just all manipulation. However, allowing these women to bond was the biggest mistake that Cameron could have ever made, and one I'm very glad that he did, because he had so much bravado, like he was so arrogant about this at this point that I don't think he realized what was going on. I also don't think Colleen really realized. I think she was just really happy to have a friend and to sort of feel like she had a normal life. Not normal, but like close to normal, like as normal as it's gonna get, right? Now, over the years, like we said, Colleen would write letters to Cameron, and it was love letters and cards. And as you can guess, later on in the trial, this was a big point of contention. But this was just one of myriad ways that Colleen chose to try to survive, like I said. By endearing herself to Cameron, Colleen was attempting to humanize herself to him, to gain sympathy and better treatment. And eventually, some of these thoughts kind of did start to stick, like a Stockholm syndrome kind of deal. After over 7 years of living this life, it made sense that in order to protect her very weak sense of self, that she would create a world in which she did love her captor. So I think, we all normalize the lives we live, even if they aren't the best, and especially if we can't do anything about the situation. And I think this sort of false love for Cameron, along with this new friendship with Jan, gave Colleen a better feeling about her life. But meanwhile, Jan, who's obviously been very good about compartmentalizing things, is being torn apart inside. I just, and I want to feel for Jan, but I just kind of don't. Now, I don't know if I had mentioned this already, but he did make the two women have sex with each other in front of him, saying it was God's plan, and also saying that God told him that Colleen needed sex. So he's moving from having the company make decisions, like every day he's like, the company, like drilling that into her head. And now he's seeing these two women are getting really into God, so he's using God to control them. It went from like, the company says this, the company says that, to God says this and God says that. So he's really just kind of moving along with whatever is going to, control them best. And for whatever reason, I think because Cameron truly felt that he had ultimate control, he allowed Colleen to get a job. He actually let her leave the house and go to work. Of course, he kept all of the money, but this was a very risky thing. So Colleen got a job working as a maid in a nearby motel and was quickly considered the hotel's best employee due to her work ethic and friendly nature. We're now, I think I said in 1984, Jan and Colleen are very into the Bible, and she's working, and they finally ask Cameron, hey, can we go to church together? He says they may, because she's been going to work and there's no issues so far. So he's like, yeah, go ahead, go to church. This was his biggest mistake yet. Jan, full of guilt and hatred and fear, started talking to the pastor at the church, sometimes with Colleen, sometimes without, always asking vague but leading questions about their situation and what she should do. She always made it sound more like a case of infidelity, but even this prompted the pastor to tell her to leave Cameron. Finally, she told him a little bit more about the situation, and he said, look, you are all living in sin. She basically told him, like, we're a throuple, and he's like, God is not down with that. And for whatever reason, him telling her, like, hey, you are living in sin was what it took. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. So on Thursday, August 9th, 1984, at 11:30 a.m., Jan went to the hotel where Colleen worked and asked to talk to her. It was then that she told her everything. She told her the company wasn't real. Cameron wasn't a part of any sort of international slave group. His family had no idea what was going on, and Colleen was free to go at any time. Colleen collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by this information, and basically beating herself up for being so stupid. And Jan was like, it's not your fault. Like, you have been so traumatized, and Jan's been traumatized. So the two women cried and held each other. And then, of course, because this is how Colleen is, she finished her last day at work. She told her boss, I have to quit, but she finished her day. And then she and Jan immediately went back to the pastor and told him the truth and asked him what to do. The man said they need to get as far away from Cameron as possible immediately. Now, the problem with this was that it was almost 4 p.m. because Cameron was about to get off work and was expecting them to pick him up. So they wouldn't be safe to try to leave that night because he was going to be home. So the pastor said, play it cool for the night, leave the following morning after he goes to work. Now, Colleen, of course, saw the danger in this because Jan could change her mind at any moment, but they agreed, and she just decided to take her chance. And also, as a side note, like, why did this pastor let them leave? Why didn't he call the police? Like, we'll never know what was going through his head that he didn't get involved. I think maybe it was that they were asking him not to, and he respected their wishes. But that's pretty fucking crazy to me if he believed a word of what they said, because this was 7.5 fucking years. Anyway, so they go home, they act normal. Jan actually said that she had a stomach ache, and she and Colleen slept on the floor in the living room, because I should tell you that they had now started letting Colleen sleep on the floor in her sleeping bag. So she wasn't even in the box anymore. Like, she was truly being integrated into their life, like almost not an equal, definitely, but much less in the slave role and much more like a second wife almost. So that night, anyway, the two of them slept on the floor. Cameron slept in the bed. Interestingly, he let that happen. I don't know what was going on. But anyway, he left for work the next morning. The women packed up their stuff, grabbed the girls, and went to Jan's sister's house. Now, only about a day or so later, Colleen said that the voice of God came to her. This was the same voice that told her to run when she was in the bathroom. And she didn't listen then, but this time she did listen. He told her, you need to leave Jan and you need to go home to your family in Riverside. You need to get out of here. So Colleen calls her dad and says, hi, it's me. Sorry, I haven't talked to you in 4 fucking years. Can you send me $100? He's like, I'll send you however much money you want. So he sends her money. She gets a bus ticket to go back to Riverside. And before she leaves to get on the bus, she goes to a payphone and she calls Cameron. She says to him, I know everything. I'm leaving you and you can't stop me. She later said she didn't remember exactly what he said, but she remembered that he cried. Colleen is now free. She goes home to Riverside. She gives her family a really truncated version of what happened, leaving out a lot of bad stuff, probably for the sake of her own mental health, but even more so, I think, at that moment because Jan had asked her to. Jan didn't want the police to be called. She wanted them to give Cameron a chance to change. But even with the little bit that her family heard, they called Cameron and threatened him and basically told him what they thought of him, which I love. Jan, on the other hand, of course, ended up going back to Cameron and with him got back in touch with Colleen, asking her, please don't go to the police, just checking in to make sure she wasn't going to. Jan said that Cameron was trying to change and the two had been going to church and counseling together and that he had stopped the bondage. Colleen agreed to not go to the police, saying she just wanted to move on with her life, but she would also call Jan like a couple times a week. And I don't know if she talked to Cameron as well, but I know it later came up in the court documents that she talked to Jan and she called the house a lot those first couple of months. She also wrote them letters that showed she still felt affection for them, though I believe this was very quickly wearing off as she was able to come more and more to her senses every day. And meanwhile, of course, Cameron stops all efforts to change, telling Jan that his issues stemmed from a hormonal imbalance and all he had to do was drink 1 beer every night and he would be fine. Absolutely fucking ridiculous. Now, at one point, about 2 months in to Colleen's freedom, Jan woke up in the middle of the night and felt Cameron super tense next to her. She asked him what was wrong and he said he didn't know. Now, she had an intuition and kind of knew that Cameron was probably going to hurt her. He was going to do something really, really bad. So to stop him from doing that, she said to him, hey, do you want to burn all of the evidence that Colleen ever lived here? He was like, yeah, I do. So they got up, they got all the bondage, all the photos, all the diaries, all the letters, everything they could possibly find. And they went in the backyard and they put it in a big drum and they lit it all on fire. Now, I will tell you right now, they did not get everything. There were photos left over. There were things that they found, but they got rid of like 95% of all of the evidence. She later said she did this because it was the only thing she could think to do to keep herself from getting hurt. She thought he was going to hurt her. And I'm pretty sure he would have. I mean, this man is capable of anything. Now, finally, Jan found another friend, somebody that was like a receptionist somewhere where she worked, and confided in this woman. And this woman is like, you need to go back to your pastor. You need to talk to him. You need to go to the police. So Jan goes back to this pastor, and with her permission, he finally does call the police and alerts them to what is going on and what had happened over the last 7.5 years. When the police arrived to the church, Jan spilled so much information that they were completely overwhelmed. And one of the reasons is that the information she gave them included a murder that nobody even knew had happened. This was the 1976 abduction and murder of Marie Elizabeth Spanicki. I don't know how you say her last name. A 19-year-old who the couple had picked up hitchhiking and who Cameron had tortured violently before murdering. He had actually cut her vocal cords inside of her throat because she wouldn't stop screaming. And when he realized that she was going to bleed to death as a result of this like disgusting surgery that he did, he strangled her to death. He then made Jan help him dump the body. And I should tell you that before he strangled her to death, he spent the night shooting her in the abdomen with a BB gun. Like, this guy is just the fucking worst. Now, unfortunately, I will tell you that he was never charged for this, as they were not able to find her body and had no other evidence besides Jan's word, which was pretty weak, all things considered. But I will tell you that she is a missing person and has been since basically when Jan said she was murdered. So he did it. We just can't prove it. Anyway, Cameron is quickly arrested and retained a big fancy lawyer. I'm not going to get into too many details of the trial, but I will tell you that I think it's the Board of Trustees for Tehama County, where Red Bluff is, tried to make the DA work a plea deal for Cameron, wherein he would only be charged for the kidnapping and given a max of 10 years. They were pushing for this because the county didn't have the money to try the case. It's absolutely insane to me that was ever an option, but luckily the DA's office pointed out that was actually against the law in a case like this, like a violent felony. You can't do that. So they ended up going to trial. But for a brief moment, Cameron believed that he might get away with a very light sentence considering what he did. Luckily, that didn't happen, and the trial did finally begin in 1985. Jan and Colleen were the star witnesses, but that was pretty rough. Jan was like on the brink of a mental breakdown the entire time. She was almost like a hostile witness for the prosecution, which is who she agreed to testify for. So it was she was very, very torn, didn't know what to do. Colleen, it was said, was so emotionless that it hurt the case because she didn't seem upset. She didn't really seem like a victim. However, after a lot of back and forth with the trial, luckily they were able to find some really damning photographs. And Cameron straight up admitted that he kidnapped Colleen. He was just saying that very quickly after he kidnapped her, everything became consensual. He never admitted to locking her in the box for as long as he did. He never admitted to the rapes. He said she liked it. Luckily, the judge was very much on the side of the prosecution, which I don't love generally, but in this case, I think it helped because he wasn't putting up with any bullshit from the defense, trying to like make Colleen look like the bad guy or otherwise victim blame, which I think in an instance like this, and especially in the 80s with rapes and things, it's like pretty easy to make the woman the bad guy. I think it's something we still do to this day. So the fact that the judge was like, absolutely not, was pretty awesome. Now, eventually Cameron was found guilty. He was given 104 years, I believe, for like all of the crimes, kidnappings, the rapes, the beatings. Like there were so many things that he was charged with and convicted of. And he is actually, this is the craziest thing, I was looking up this case like a week ago when I was researching it, and he is up for like parole. And not even like parole, I guess, but to go live in a fucking halfway house. So they're trying to classify him as a sexually violent predator, because if they do that, then he'll have to remain in like the prison hospital where he is currently. He's in his 70s now. But if they decide that they don't think he's a danger anymore, this motherfucker's going to get out and he's going to live in a halfway house. And we're talking like his trial's next month, or his hearing. It's not even really a trial, it's a hearing. So this man could fucking get out, which like terrifies me, and I'm sure terrifies Colleen. Now, as far as Colleen goes, she's written a few, or only one book, I guess, but she's done a lot of interviews and, you know, has a lot to say about her experience. I think it took her a while to kind of heal and get over it. I think during the trial, she was still very much in the midst of her trauma. And now, you know, she's a bit older. She got married. She had kids. Like, she's just like a happy person. I didn't get to read very much of her book. I actually read a book written by the prosecutor on this case. That was where I got the majority of my information. But her book is a much more uplifting kind of message, even though it's like pretty gnarly. I recommend everybody look her up. She's like a very motivational person. She's really great. She talks about, you know, overcoming the traumas that occurred in her life. It's pretty inspirational. I have no idea what happened to Jan. I do know that Colleen tried to see her after the trial, and Jan refused to see her and blamed her for ruining her life. So this woman just could never get her shit together. And she got off, you know, she was given immunity in return for her testimony, but I think she should have gone to prison for a very long time. Even though I know she was a victim, she was also a willing participant. In any case, so that's the case. Sorry, I'm a day late, you guys. I got really overwhelmed with work this week and just had no time. But I got a tarot reading last night, and the cards that he pulled, he basically said, if you do something, and he had no idea, I'd never met him, I just walked up. He said, if you do something like a YouTube channel that you release something every week, it's more important that you're consistent than you put out a perfect product every time. He said, if it takes you 6 months to put out a perfect product or 1 week to put out a product that you like, that people will want, do it every week. So I forced myself to finish recording this, even though I don't have time. I'm going out of town this weekend because a guy with some tarot cards told me to. So I apologize if it's not as perfect as some of my other ones, because, you know, my other ones are definitely perfect. And also this one's a little bit longer. I considered doing a 2-parter, but we've done too many of those lately. So we're just going to keep it to one long episode. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. I left a lot out. I could talk about this case for like 10 episodes. It could be its own mini series for sure. But I wanted to cover it because it's such a fucking crazy case. Like, there's not really any other case out there like this. And so I really wanted to talk about it because it's absolutely wild. And thinking about the psychology of it is absolutely wild. So I hope you guys enjoyed my version of this. I'll be back next week with another case, of course. Thanks everybody for listening. Please like, rate, review, share with your friends and family. And until next week, stay safe.